We're about to dial in pro camera settings for video, even if it's on a cell phone. Wait, camera settings? How am I supposed to make an engaging video about camera settings? Could you imagine buying a $50,000 RED camera and putting it on auto? You can't put a RED camera on auto. That's like buying Eleanor and putting an automatic transmission in it. Who does that? If you really want your footage to get better, you need to understand and start filming with manual settings. It makes all the difference in the world. And I understand some of you guys are saying, hey, we have cell phones and, well, they only have auto, and that's what we're gonna have to use. Well, I'm here to tell you that's not true. To make this cell phone close to a pro camera, or at least something you can do YouTube work with, all you really need to do is get a good app for it. You don't need this thing. These things are like junk, and it just like vignettes when you look through it. It's really shaky too, so yeah, you don't need that. What you can get is Open Camera for Android, or if you're an Apple user, you can get FilMiC Pro. They also make FilMiC Pro for Android as well. All the settings we're gonna go over in this video should pretty much be an Open Camera. FilMiC is actually a step up from it. It's about $15. Honestly, if you have the 15 bucks, I think it'll be the best app you ever buy for your phone. So if you're watching this and you're gonna be working with your phone, go ahead and just pause the video, put them on your phone, and then come back. I'm not gonna be like those other YouTubers and make you wait to the end of the video for the best part. Or would I? For everyone else, let's fire up those cameras, and we're gonna start with the fixed settings. Those settings you're gonna do first and pretty much leave alone for the entirety of your shoot. For example, aspect ratio. Do you want a nice wide 16:9, or do you want it to be a square 1:1? Honestly, we usually shoot in 16:9, even if we're gonna post to Instagram and then crop it to square later. You just have to be careful, because when you're filming, you might have too much stuff going on the sides and the video might not make any sense. Plus, watch that 1 minute cutoff. Longer videos on Instagram, they don't get as much exposure. The second thing we're gonna go over is video quality. Do you wanna record in 4K, 1080p, or if you have a really expensive camera, 5.6 or even 8K? If it's for YouTube, we recommend recording in 4K if you can, and if your camera doesn't overheat, like our Sony a6300. I hate you, Sony. Because when you record in 4K, you can crop in, and then that will still output at about 1080, depending on how tight you crop in if you want to zoom back and forth between cuts. Because some of us can't do a whole YouTube video without pausing to read our notes. Nobody's perfect. Otherwise, 1080 will be just fine, because honestly, most people are going to watch YouTube videos on 1080, and even a lot of our client work, we film in 1080. And then when it comes to the drone, we actually use 4K, 2.7K, or 1080 as well, depending on what frame rate we want. And that leads us into the next thing. What's your frame rate going to be? It needs to be 24 frames per second for a smoother cinematic look. That means everything you film needs to be in 24 frames per second. That's really important. If you need slow-mo, you can raise your frame rate, but everything else is 24. We had a really bad habit in the beginning of running our frame rate at the highest possible setting, like 120 or 60. And it looks decent, but it gets kind of jumpy and choppy, and sometimes it can actually interfere with lighting and everything else. So you want to do 24 frames per second. Now, if you are going for slow motion, you can do 30 frames per second and slow it down to 80%. That takes a clip where, say, someone's walking or doing something that's got a little bit of movement in it, and it just slows it down a little bit. It kind of gives it that buttery feel, but it's not quite real slow motion. You really can't do dialogue or anything with that, but if it's just gonna have music over it, that's okay. Then you could bump up to 60 frames per second, which will give you a nice slow motion, and on most cameras still allow for pretty high video quality. The next setting up from that is 120, which gives you a really nice slow motion, and honestly, that's all you're ever really gonna need. Now, for you DJI fans out there, if you want slow motion and high quality, I recommend setting your camera to 2.7K, which is right in the middle between 1080 and 4K, and pick 60 frames per second for high quality slow motion footage. That can give you some really dramatic shots. That 2.7K is a lifesaver on DJI drones. DJI, everybody always messes that up. Now this one will throw a lot of people in the beginning. shutter speed. What do you do for shutter speed? That's not frame rate, that's different. It's kind of like when you're taking a picture. Shutter speed is how long the shutter is open for each frame. It's based on per second. So if you have, say, 24 frames per second, you want about half of the shutter speed per frame, or 1/50. And I know that's kind of confusing, but what we try to do is take the bottom number and double it based on whatever our frame rate is. 30 frames per second would be 1/60, 60 would be 1/120, and 120 would be 1/250, because we're not real good at math, but that's what most cameras have. If you get your shutter speed too long or too short, it can make your footage a little blurry and not very sharp, or it can make it really jumpy. So you really can't compensate for exposure with your shutter speed in video. I don't recommend it. The one time you can make adjustments to help is if you're filming under fluorescent lights. So when you're filming in the United States under fluorescent lights, I believe it's 60 Hertz and I think Europe is 50. So if you're filming at 24 frames per second with a 1/50 shutter speed, those are going to offset, and that's going to make those fluorescent lights flicker. And that flickering can be really annoying, especially if you don't notice it until you get back to edit. So how we combat that is if we're shooting 24 frames per second, we change the shutter speed from 1/50 to 1/60, which will repair that little bit of flicker, or we just film it in 30 frames per second at 1/60. This is something you have to think about because this has happened to us quite a few times when we're filming client work. So the fifth thing, I think we're at 5, that we're gonna go over is bitrate. Bitrate really doesn't have to be as complicated as it sounds. It's just the quality that the camera is recording the footage at, meaning the amount of data it's using to record and save that footage. The higher the bitrate, the higher quality the footage will be. So say you have like a really cheap drone you buy from Walmart for $40 or $50, and it says it's 4K, but then you upload that footage and it looks really choppy and weird. It's because it's recording at a really low bit rate because the processing power is just not very good. I mean, it's a $50 drone, what do you expect? A telltale sign of poor bit rate is when you're watching something and you notice little pieces of the footage gets kind of jumpy. That's usually a low bit rate. And that's often because your connection is bad or because the video is just low quality to begin with. So at the end of the day, what that means for us, whenever possible, just record at the highest bit rate you can, whatever your settings will allow. I understand if you're doing a lot of just little videos and you don't have a lot of hard drive space, maybe back it down a little because YouTube is not going to use your maximum bit rate, but try to keep it as high as possible unless you have a good reason not to. Now, the sixth thing we're going to go over is actually from the lighting video, and that's white balance. White balance is incredibly important, and this has to be locked in for your entire shoot. If you let your white balance go to auto and the camera tries to compensate, depending on whether you're facing a window or somewhere else, it's going to make your footage look really bad and really inconsistent. So you're actually better off to have manual white balance be a little bit wrong than auto white balance be changing throughout your footage. I'm telling you this because in camera, you want to get this as close as you can ahead of time. And there are several settings for this. You're going to have daylight, cloudy, incandescent, fluorescent, and then you're going to have like a +1, -1, 0, and then custom. I just recommend going through those settings and seeing what works for your environment. Sometimes I've used cloudy, for example, on a daylight balanced light in the studio. It just works if that's all the camera has. Ideally, you just want to go into custom and adjust it until everything looks as close as possible, and then you can finish those fine-tune adjustments in post. Now, this last fixed setting is something that I struggled with a lot, and actually I still struggle a little bit with it today, and that is whether to shoot in autofocus or manual focus. Generally, if you're shooting video, you're going to want to be in manual focus all the time. You're not going to want to have your camera trying to pick what it's focusing on. It's going to hunt. Hunting is just the camera looking for whatever it thinks it's supposed to focus on. So for example, if I put my hand in front of the camera, it's going to focus on my hand. But if my hand is on the edge of the focus area, it's going to like jump back and forth because the camera doesn't know what it wants to focus on. So if you put it on manual, you can lock on a fixed subject or a subject that you're staying the same distance from, or you can adjust the focus as you move in and out. And for YouTube videos, we actually use autofocus when we can. Now, cell phones, it depends on how good your cell phone is. You may want to stick to manual focus and just try to keep yourself relatively centered within that range. But if you're going to use a mirrorless camera like this A6300 we have, you'll want to put it in autofocus and set that focus position on the person's face. So when we first started, we actually just had it on center, and that works, but the problem is it would adjust for my chest moving in and out if I was moving my hands, which in the first video I did way too much. We went over that. So we went into our settings and manually moved the focus from the center point up to our face. So the camera would always focus on this area right here and not over here and not right here, but just right in the center. If you're just running gun and out there trying to get some shots for like a documentary or something like that, autofocus can be pretty handy and you can get away with it, especially if you're on a gimbal. Buying the little focus module for the gimbal is kind of cumbersome. I really never used them. I even based buying a gimbal on what focus module I could have. The reality is I don't really ever use them. You just don't need it. And honestly, in the beginning, you really don't need a gimbal either. I don't use it that much. They can be handy occasionally, and after all my purchases, I went with the Moza Air 2, which is really heavy, but it is very reliable. I'll link it down below in case any of you guys want to waste some money. The last part we need to go over is exposure. I figured we ought to change it up and try to make it a little more interesting. Exposure has 3 components to it: ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. Shutter speed we can roll out right away because in most cases you do not want to adjust that to compensate for light and video. So let's focus on aperture and ISO. Most cameras have the ability to control ISO. On this Mavic 2 Pro, it has ISO ranging from 100 all the way up to 6400. So right now we have it set on 200 and the quality is really, really good. As we move it up from 200, 4, 8, 16, 3200, all the way to 6400, the quality drops off and gets totally unusable. This is where ISO doesn't really work that well, especially on something with a smaller sensor size or a cheaper camera. The processing power can only compensate so much because it's actually just digitally enhancing the image. The best way to improve this is to allow more light. And with video, the only good way to allow more light in is to open up the aperture. So right now on this Mavic 2, we have the aperture set at 2.8. Now this applies to cell phones and cameras as well. So this is just an example of what aperture does. The smaller the number, or f-stop, the wider open the aperture is and the brighter it is. The larger the f number, the more closed the aperture is, or the darker it is. So as we go through this, you'll see from f2.8, and we're gonna go up through f5, f7, f9, all the way to f11, it gets really, really dark. In this instance, we're actually exposing for the sunset, so that actually improves this shot. So it is really helpful. But as you'll see, there are other things you want to do with the aperture. You don't always just want to use it to control the amount of light that's coming into your sensor. Let's check that out now. So the aperture also controls your depth of field. If you have the aperture wide open, your depth of field is going to be very narrow or short. It's only going to keep a little bit in focus at any given time. So if you want your background to be really blurry and your subject to really stand out, you want to have your aperture wide open. Now, if you close the aperture, it's going to make the background and the foreground be more in focus, allowing you to see everything at once. So if you look at these two examples, the one on the left actually has a really narrow depth of field and only the subject is in focus and everything else is blurred out. The one on the right has a lot more in focus because the aperture is closed and it has a longer depth of field. This has been episode 3 of our Road to 10,000 series. We're growing our channels from scratch. We really appreciate you sticking it out, and we have a really small giveaway if anyone wants it. You know, the lens from the thumbnail that I made fun of at the beginning of the video. If any of you guys want this or the other lenses that came with it, could be a lot of fun just to play around with. If you put a comment below of how this video could be helpful to you, or if you have any advice for us, and just mention that you want the kit, we'll randomly pick one of the comments that comes out this week. So in the next 5 days from the publishing of this video. We're still a small channel, so your odds are pretty good. Aside from that, if you guys have any other questions, make sure you hit us up in the comments below. And we're gonna go ahead and put some settings from a few different scenarios where we shoot in the description. So you can kind of use that as like a cheat sheet. Come to think of it, there's one last setting I wanna make sure you guys have locked down. If you actually look at this video, right below it, there's a little red button, it says subscribe. Make sure you click that button. It'll make all of your videos so much better. It's the most important setting you will ever click on in your life. We'll see you in the next one, guys. Thank you.